All right, let's begin. Let's get started. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ol Shaked. I'm the Deputy Director of the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise, or AICE, and I'll be moderating today's meaningful discussion on the impact of the Jewish vote in the 2024 U.S. elections. To start, I'd like to introduce our organization briefly. AICE is dedicated to fostering strong ties between the U.S. and Israel, particularly at a time when access to accurate information, as you very well know, about Israel and Jewish history is so essential. One of AICE's most impactful initiatives is the Jewish Virtual Library, or JVL. Since 1997, the JVL has grown to include over 27,000 articles, becoming the most comprehensive online resource on Jewish and Israeli history, politics, and culture. The JVL is a trusted resource for students, educators, journalists, and the general public. After October 7th, 2023, over 2 million people relied on the JVL for reliable information amid a flood of misinformation about the war in Gaza, underscoring the library's essential role in providing clear and factual insights. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Mitchell Bard, the Executive Director of AICE and the Director of the JVL. As an authority on U.S. Middle East policy, Dr. Bard has appeared on international, national, and local TV and radio outlets, and his articles are published in major newspapers, magazines, and academic journals. He is the author of 22 books. He holds a PhD in political science from UCLA, a master's degree in public policy from Berkeley, and a BA in economics from UC Santa Barbara. Dr. Bard will now share his insights on today's topic. Following this presentation, which should be roughly 35-40 minutes, I'll take your questions from the chat box for our Q&A session. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitchell Bard. You have the floor.
I hear tremendous clapping in the background. Thank you all for coming. The discussion tonight will be on more statistical than policy. I am not going to try to convince you who to vote for or talk about the candidates' positions on the issues, but try to tell you a little bit about the history of the Jewish electorate and what might be expected in this election. As you may know, there is a, why is this not working? 2% of the US population, sorry for that. Jews make up about 2% of the US population. The question in terms of the election is, why should anyone care about only 2% of the US population? What possible difference could they make in the vote? Well, for one thing, Jews tend to vote in disproportionate numbers, that the average is higher than the overall average for turnout in elections among Jews. Secondly, the candidates themselves think that the Jewish vote matters. So the fact that they believe it, to some extent, makes it true. The vast majority of Jews live in purple states, that is, the states that are neither consistently Republican or Democratic, so that any constituency really can make a difference in those states, including the Jewish voters. Jewish voters also are concentrated in the key electoral college states that will decide who becomes the president. And Jews also donate disproportionate amounts of money to candidates. And since money is, they say, the mother's milk of politics, being able to solicit donors who are eager to support candidates who are supportive of their positions on Israel and other matters can count on significant support from the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community more generally. And just to give you, again, a sense of presidential candidates caring about the Jewish vote. You can go all the way back to 1909 and William Howard Taft going to a synagogue in Pittsburgh. You had Harry Truman, of course, who may have been the most important president in having recognized the state of Israel and talking a lot about the Jewish vote. He was probably the first president who discussed it in great detail and depended on it to some degree in his close victory over Thomas Dewey. You had Bill Clinton, who in this picture, I believe, was right after the eulogy for Yitzhak Rabin. I think you can see here that George W. Bush had an interest in the Jews. Barack Obama was at my old synagogue in Washington, D.C. You may remember this picture from Donald Trump. And this was Joe Biden in about a year ago when he was in Israel. So you see that the candidates have an interest. Kamala Harris, I didn't put in a picture of her, but I'm sure you know that she's talked plenty about Israel and what she wants to do in the Middle East in order to cultivate some of the Jewish voters. Now, how do they break down in terms of religious observance? About a third are Reform Jews, 15% conservatives, and only about 8% are Orthodox. The rest are non-affiliated. Some small number are Reconstructionist or some other affiliation, but these are the three main ones. If you look at how they vote and how they identify both ideologically and politically, you can see that 60%, this is in the most recent poll that was done by the Manhattan Institute, 60% identified as Democrats, 23% Republicans, 15% independent. And the overwhelming majority of Jews are liberal or moderate, nearly half liberal, and only about a quarter consider themselves conservative. Why are Jews historically liberal and identifying with the Democratic Party? Well, there are a few sort of aphorisms that people have offered for why Jews are associated with the Democrats. The last one sort of tongue-in-cheek, but more serious explanation came from Gil Troy, who's a scholar in the subject, and he noted that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal helped Jews, along with everyone else coming out of the Great Depression. His New Deal was directed towards providing for the people who most needed help from the government. They also were supporting him because of World War II and the expectation that he was going to win the war for the United States, and in winning the war, that would save the Jews of Europe. Of course, in the years that have followed, there's been a lot of reconsideration of just how much Roosevelt did for saving the Jews of Europe. I wrote a book I'd recommend to you called Forgotten Victims, the Abandonment of Americans in Hitler's Camps, where I talk about what the Roosevelt administration did and mostly didn't do to help Jews at the time. But historically, the Jewish people have loved Roosevelt and saw him as a kind of savior. Jews also, of course, have a long history of persecution. And from even before the Holocaust to the Tsarist oppression in Russia, and even before that in other places, Jews came to see themselves and other downtrodden people as needing tolerance and support for a society to be free. It's in the totalitarian societies like the Soviet Union or Tsarist Russia, or in Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, that Jews would suffer and being the canaries in the coal mine, usually others would suffer along with them. Whoops, sorry about that. And last, Jews like the idea of big government in order to help themselves and also those downtrodden people, but they don't like Big Brother. That is, they tend to be liberal on a variety of different issues and don't think the government should be telling them what to do or passing laws on issues like divorce and abortion and homosexuality and the like. So all of those things contribute to them being more liberal and tending then to vote Democratic. Now, you hear a lot about Jews becoming more Republican. The Republican Jews like to talk about this all the time, that Jews have turned away from the Democratic Party, joining in bigger and bigger numbers the Republican Party. But as you can see from this little table, it's only a small sliver of the Jewish community, that is the Orthodox, who make up, as I said, only 8% of the whole Jewish population. They are becoming much more affiliated with with the Republican Party. As you can see, jumping from 57 to 75 just in 7 years. And that number has probably gone up a little bit since 2020. But when you look at the conservative and reform Jews, they have actually become more supportive of the Democratic Party. And you add them all up together, and the Jewish community as a whole still is overwhelmingly Democratic with 71%. The difference in that small group of Orthodox Jews becoming more Republican means that the Republican Party probably has picked up something like 100,000 extra votes that it didn't have in the past. If we look at presidential elections historically, going back to 1968, that first circle you see at the top is Hubert Humphrey got the highest percentage of the Jewish vote ever, 81%. If you move down to the second circle, you'll see the Republican who got the highest percentage, which was Ronald Reagan, in 39%. And that arrow surrounding him is Jimmy Carter. When he ran against Gerald Ford, he got the typical support from the Jewish community, 71%. But over the course of his presidency, some of you may remember, even though he was so intimately involved in the negotiation of the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty, he adopted other policies that were less sympathetic to Israel. And by the end of his term, many Jews considered him one of the most unsympathetic presidents toward Israel in history. And they punished him by reducing his vote to the all-time low of 45%. And that was partly also due to the third-party candidate, John Anderson. That happened to be the first presidential election I ever voted in, and I voted for Anderson. So I was with a lot of the Jewish community at the time. If you look at that next circle, that's Walter Mondale, who got the lowest percentage of the Jewish vote other than Jimmy Carter, at 57%. That next arrow is another indication of how Jewish voters can turn on a president who they don't feel is supportive of Jewish interests and of Israel. Bush did very well, relatively speaking. His first go around, he actually got a higher Jewish vote than Reagan did in his second term, largely, I would argue, because people were expecting him to carry on with Ronald Reagan's pro-Israel policies. As it turned out, he didn't, and many Jews saw him as one of, if not the most anti-Israel presidents ever, and that was reflected in the change in his support in the Jewish community all the way from 35 to 11%. We skip ahead to the last 20 years, you can see another couple of trends with Obama and Trump. In Obama's case, again, he was seen as very likable by the Jewish community, compatible with their interests. But over the course of his term, many Jews, again, thought that his policies toward Israel were hostile, or at least not as sympathetic as they would like. And he lost a fairly significant share of the Jewish vote in his second term. Still enough, obviously, though, to win because of his support from the other constituencies. In the case of Donald Trump, he came in with not a particularly high support from the Jewish community. Over the course of his 4 years, many Jews, again, thought that he was one of, if not the most pro-Israel presidents. And a number of Jews shifted in his direction. So he went from 24 to 30%. If you look overall, then, from 1968 on, the average vote for a president for a Democratic candidate is 71% of the Jewish vote and 26% for the Republican. And as I showed you on the previous chart, Humphrey had the record for Democrats with 81, and Reagan the record for a Republican with 39. I mentioned early that one of the reasons that we care about the Jewish vote is their concentration in key states. You need 270 electoral votes to become the president. If you look at just the top 4 states with the largest Jewish population, that's good for 126. If you look at the top 10 states with the largest Jewish population, a candidate could get to 238. And the top 12 states where 84% of all Jews live would get you 1 vote more than you need to be the president. 74% of Jews live in 18 of the blue states. That is, those are the states that consistently vote for a Democratic candidate. So in those states, Jews aren't going to make much of a difference because a Democrat's going to win no matter what. You can see this here, those top states that add up to the 271. You have at the top, of course, New York and California, where the most Jews live. Those states going to go Democratic easily, so the Jewish votes that are concentrated there aren't going to make any difference. Florida has changed. It's generally regarded still as up in the air, but it's become more and more Republican in recent years. So it's probably not going to be in play, but there is a high Jewish concentration in Florida. And as we saw in the Gore-Bush election, the Jewish vote could make some difference if it were a close election, but that's not expected to be the case this year. New Jersey, another blue state, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Maryland, all blue states. Texas, very solidly red state, so Jews aren't going to make much of a difference there. The states that also have been up for grabs over a period of time: Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, and Georgia. Ohio's become more solidly Republican in recent elections, so that probably will not make much of a difference. Virginia has become more of a purple state, and Jews are a relatively small percentage there, but in theory, in a close election could make some difference. Georgia, we know, was very important and again, not a huge Jewish population there, but every vote's going to count in this election. The one that people pay the most attention to that I skipped over was Pennsylvania, where you do have a significant Jewish population, more than 400,000 potential votes there. And we don't know how they're going to vote yet. But given the fact that that is going to be a very close election, having that many Jewish voters could potentially swing that state. What do Jews care about? You know, there's an assumption that Jews care most about Israel and that that's what they vote on. If you look at most of the polls that have been done in the last year, usually Israel or the Israel war with Hamas are near the bottom of the list. In this most recent poll that I looked at, Israel actually came out and anti-Semitism 4th on the list, but still Jews are like most of the rest of the country. They see the abortion issue is important, the economy, democracy. Immigration's a little lower in the Jewish community, at least in this poll, than for most of the public, which places it at or near the top. But you can see that Israel is not usually the issue on which most Jews make their decisions. That being said, if you have a president or if you have a candidate whose positions are extreme, are seen as very good for Israel or very bad for Israel, that tends to be reflected in the vote, which is why you saw the results in those prior elections that you did. Who are Jews going to vote for based on what we know from the polls? These were 4 of the most recent polls asking Jews who they would vote for. And you can see that on average, Kamala Harris would get 65% of the vote compared to 30% for Trump. 30 is about what he got in the last election, but 65% would be a potential disaster for the vice president, because this would, as you see, be the lowest share of the Jewish vote since Dukakis in '88, and historically the lowest percentage any Democrat got and was able to win was Biden with 68% in 2020. So you can see she's doing even worse than Biden did. That could be a potential problem for her. What about the Orthodox Jews? We talked about how they had become more Republican earlier. Well, we're talking about a small number of people, 600,000 Orthodox Jews roughly. And Orthodox Jews, like the rest of the Jewish community, are not monolithic. You have about 1/3 who identify as modern Orthodox, and the other 2/3 are ultra-Orthodox or Haredi. And you can see here the numbers in the polling that show that modern Orthodox are not completely split, but much closer in terms of their vote for a Democrat and Republican than the ultra-Orthodox, who are obviously all in for the Republican, for Donald Trump. Now, in terms of the number of votes, again, we're not talking about a large number, a total of 450,000 votes overall that would be going to Donald Trump compared to 136,000 for Trump. But the only one of the swing states where the election is expected to be decided, where there's a large Orthodox Jewish community, is in Pennsylvania. Ira might know the exact numbers. I don't know how many Orthodox Jews live in Pennsylvania, but it's probably not a huge number, but again, enough to potentially make a difference in a swing state. These are the 7 swing states. And if you look at the vote in 2020, and this is hypothetical, I came up with the Jewish vote just based on the overall vote that the Jews cast for Biden in 2020. So just assuming that 70% of Jews in each of those states voted for Biden and 30% for Trump, this is the number of votes that each of them would have gotten. It could be that in Arizona, say, the vote was 50-40 or 60-30. So it wasn't necessarily 70-30 in every state, but just for the sake of argument, we'll look at it that way. And you can see the margin is not the margin in the Jewish vote, that's the margin that Donald Trump either lost by, or in the case of North Carolina, that he won by. Now, some of the predictions are that Trump could get 35% of the Jewish vote. So what kind of a difference would that make? You could see going from 30 to 35, in the vote would be that much closer for Trump. The Republican Jewish coalition thinks that Trump could get 50% of the swing votes. And again, just hypothetically, if it was 50% in each of those states, Trump would actually win Arizona and Georgia, assuming nothing else changed. Everybody else voted the same way. And he would reduce his deficit in Pennsylvania to 27,000. He'd still need to make up that 27,000 vote deficit, but it's a lot smaller than the 80,000 it was in 2020. So this is hypothetically how Trump could do much better in these key swing states if, in fact, the Jewish vote were to shift in his direction in a significant way from what it was in 2020. What about Michigan? This is where you hear all about the Arab population. There's only about 220,000. It's probably a little more today. There isn't a lot of discussion about the distinctions among the Arab population. The Arab population, like the Jewish population, is also not monolithic. The majority of Arab Americans in this country are Lebanese Christians, and they are in this country in part because they fled the oppression they felt from the PLO in the earlier days, and more recently from the Hezbollah and other Muslim populations. And the Lebanese Christians tend to not vote the same way as other Arab Americans because of that. In this election, it's hard to tell. The Lebanese Christians may be just as angry as other Arab Americans because of the U.S. support for Israel's activities in Lebanon as well as in Gaza. The Arab population is tiny, but because it's a close election, everyone's looking at it. But when an election is close, you can say that any of the constituencies can make a difference. You can say it's the Jews, or you can say it's the Arabs. It could be the Hispanics. It could be any of the coalitions if their vote changes from one candidate to the other. But the Arab population certainly has gotten a lot of attention. Many of them have suggested they won't vote at all, or perhaps they'll vote for the third-party candidate, Jill Stein, whose positions are very critical of Israel. And all of that would hurt Harris, because Biden had gotten overwhelming support from the Arab community in the last election, and typically the Arab Americans vote overwhelmingly for a Democrat. Trump, just to remind you, lost by 154,000 votes. If every single Arab American voted for him, and he could win, assuming everything else was equal. But a lot of Arab Americans also remember that Donald Trump had a ban on immigrants from Muslim majority countries. Some may be overlooking that because of their anger over the Gaza war, but many in the voting booth may decide they can't go the distance to change to Trump. Now, I also mentioned that money is a big reason why candidates pay attention to the Jewish community. And you can see that AIPAC alone, not even through the entire electoral cycle yet, but beginning in the 23-24, has given almost $34 million to candidates. And this is a huge change, because as some of you may know, AIPAC used to always say, we're not a PAC. We don't rate or endorse candidates. We don't give any money to candidates. But they made a strategic decision because of some of the growth of candidates who are critical of Israel, and the view that they could make a significant difference in ensuring a pro-Israel Congress, decided to create political action committees to contribute to candidates. AIPAC believes, and most of the American Jewish community believes, that Israel needs to be a bipartisan issue, that in order for the U.S. Israel relationship to prosper, you have to have support from both Republicans and Democrats. And so that's reflected to a large degree in who AIPAC has given money to. You also have to take into consideration that AIPAC and other PACs typically support the incumbents based on their records and based on the fact that, especially in the House, they almost always win. So that's another reason why a number of these candidates will get the support they do. The Republican Jewish Coalition, not surprisingly, gives all of its money to Republicans. Now, J Street's kind of interesting. Before AIPAC came along and joined the PAC community, they were the biggest contributors among the Jewish community. They only gave about $4 million, as they're doing again this year, but they say that they're the pro-Israel, pro-peace party, but they clearly are not signing on to the idea that bipartisanship is important for the U.S. Israel relationship, because they give all of their money to Democrats. You see, there's also a Democratic Majority for Israel PAC that also gives all of its money to Democrats. There are a number of other PACs besides these, but they're much smaller. Now, how does the Jewish giving compare to the rest of the world? Well, pro-Israel PACs, because of AIPAC, are on the top list of contributors to the campaign in this cycle, but you can see they're dwarfed by some of the other special interest groups. So when people talk about Jewish money, there's a certain degree of bigotry there, because they don't talk typically the same way about the money contributed by other groups who, like the pro-Israel community, are giving money to candidates who are supportive of their particular interests. Individual Jews are also very involved in contributing to campaigns. You can see the ones that are shaded blue on the right-hand side. Those are individuals who are giving to Democratic candidates. You can see that on this list of at least the top 15, most of them are giving to Republicans. The names in red are the Jewish donors, and you see out of 15, there are 6 Jewish contributors. Bloomberg just gave another $50 million to the Harris campaign, so he'll jump up near the top of the list. Miriam Adelson, who's the widow, Sheldon passed away, has given, you can see, $135 million to Trump. So there's a lot of money going from Jewish donors to the different candidates. There are other big donors to the Democrats, people like Chaim Saban that aren't on this list, but are giving significant amounts as well. Giving money, lobbying, it's all about power politics. Who do we want in Congress? Who is going to ensure that the U.S. Israel relationship stays strong? Well, in the most expensive House primary ever, AIPAC donated $14 million to defeat Jamal Bowman, who was a congressman in New York. He was someone who was a member of the Squad. That's the group of about 8 or 10 of the most anti-Israel members of Congress, who are also extremely progressive. Even by progressive standards, they're far to the left. He was a critic of Israel, but it wasn't just his policies on Israel that were the reason that he lost. In almost every example where the pro-Israel community gets really involved in trying to defeat a candidate, it's typically other issues that are the deciding factors. In the case of Bowman, he was not supportive of a lot of the policies that his constituents believed in, and he frequently was unsupportive of the president's agenda. He also attracted a lot of ridicule for a stunt he pulled, where he pulled the fire alarm and forced all of the members of the House to evacuate the building. The other big electoral race that AIPAC got involved in the primaries was the effort to defeat Cori Bush in Missouri. And she was another of the very critical members of the squad. So that was what made her a target of the pro-Israel community. But she, again, was someone who lost primarily because of her policies and her failure to take care of her constituents. She was very unpopular with a lot of her constituents. And she, again, like Bowman, voted against some of Biden's more popular policies, in particular, in her case, the infrastructure bill. She also was running against someone who was a very popular candidate. That was true of Bowman as well. Now, to show you that just the fact that pro-Israel PACs or individuals are giving money to try to defeat the candidates who they think are unsupportive of their interests and unsupportive in particular of Israel, AIPAC doesn't win all the time. There was one primary in particular where it was trying to defeat a state senator named Dave Min from winning his primary, and they lost. The two members of Congress who are considered the most anti-Israel, Rashida Tlaib in Michigan and Ilhan Omar in Minnesota, AIPAC isn't even trying to beat them. They are so entrenched and have such support from their constituents that AIPAC and the pro-Israel community in general doesn't think it's worth the money to try to defeat them. And it's interesting because in the last election, Ilhan Omar was nearly defeated, even though her opponent got very little money from the Jewish community. And some people thought that was a big mistake in the end. That same person is running again, but isn't getting the kind of support that would even make him a serious contender. Why is it that the pro-Israel PACs get so much attention? I would argue it has to do with anti-Semitism, because why aren't people attacking Emily's List for giving money only to candidates who are supportive of women's issues? You know, why is it that other PACs that are supporting either pro-life or pro-choice candidates don't get the same kind of attacks that the pro-Israel community does? The fact is that Jews are exercising the same constitutional right as everyone else to support the candidates that reflect their points of view. And funding is critical for candidates. And one of the reasons that it's so important that pro-Israel PACs give money is it creates a disincentive to be anti-Israel. Given the amount of money that goes to candidates who are supportive of Israel, why would you choose to be critical of Israel? Not many people like Tlaib and Omar can get away with it. More likely, you're going to suffer the fate of Bowman and Bush. And being anti-Israel isn't going to win you a lot of support. There isn't a lot of money out there from pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab PACs or anti-Israel PACs. So from a purely pragmatic standpoint, if you're a politician, it is much more in your interest to be sympathetic to Israel than it is to be critical. I'll stop there. I encourage you to support the work of the Jewish Virtual Library. We're in the process of redesigning it, and we certainly could use your help. And we hope that we'll be able to do more of these webinars in the future. And I'll open it up to questions. You should be able to put them in the chat, or we'll moderate them.
Yes, does anybody have any questions?
Can you hear me?
You should type it into your chat.
Well, Mr. CJ is typing. Anybody else? CJ, why don't you just go ahead and ask the question, please?
Yeah, it takes longer to type. What are the factors making the Orthodox, particularly the ultra-Orthodox, so different from the rest of the Jewish community?
I think there's probably a few reasons. One is that the Orthodox in particular see Donald Trump as extremely pro-Israel. They also like some of the conservative values that the Republicans have, that they are less supportive of things like abortion, of gay rights, of some of these other social issues, that they are more like typical conservatives. And you see this in other communities as well. You see this, among, for example, some of the religious people in the Black community that are more conservative, whereas people typically think of the Black community as being especially liberal, but there's a segment of that that's very conservative, largely on religious grounds. Same goes for the Hispanic community. So I think there's a combination of the Orthodox seeing the Republicans as better reflecting their conservative values. They're being concerned of what they see as the woke culture and what they see as a negative impact of the far left on the Democratic Party. The number of anti-Semites or the tolerance of anti-Semitism that some believe they see in the Democratic Party. I think all of these are contributors to why the Orthodox have moved in the Republican direction.
Okay, thank you.
If I could, Mitch, I think that was a good list. I would add to it on the basis of what I've seen in Florida, that part of it is also that Republicans are more likely to support school vouchers than our Democrats. If you've got 3 or 4 kids in a private Jewish school, the school vouchers, I think, are quite important. I would add, by the way, I did a presentation on the same topic Tuesday night for the University of Miami. You did a very good job, Mitch. I would add on the Orthodox that since such a high percentage of them, particularly the ultra-Orthodox, who tend to be more toward the Republican side, right, even than the modern Orthodox, live in New York and California, which are not swing states, that the fact that so many of them are voting Orthodox really probably doesn't have much of an impact on the election. And the other thing that I did for my presentation was I went through the data as best as I could, and there are only about 35,000 Orthodox in the 7 swing states combined, most of them in Pennsylvania, and those are also not the states that have ultra-Orthodox in them. So that the Orthodox being different probably is not going to have as big an impact on the national election. Within New York, let's say in some of the congressional districts with a large percentage of ultra-Orthodox in particular, they could have a big effect on who gets elected to Congress. But I don't think they're going to have much of an effect on who gets elected to the presidency.
Well, I think that's right, that they're concentrated in pretty narrow areas. And I didn't talk about the local elections. That's a whole nother big issue, but you're right. Certainly in certain places, Jews will have a much bigger impact, the ultra-Orthodox in parts of New York, but also Jews in parts of California and parts of Florida and other local races.
Yes, I also saw that you have another question.
Yes.
Yeah, Mitch, who do you think's going to win the election?
I think I know actually for certain, unlike all these other kibitzers, I know for certain who's going to win the election. the person with the most electoral votes.
Right. Thank you.
All right, next question. Maya Dolgan, have you seen any statistics breaking down the Jewish vote by generation or age?
By generational age.
Generation or age?
Well, I haven't. Ira probably has. I know breakdowns in terms of generation support for Israel, but I didn't look at figures for how it breaks down politically. Ira, do you know?
I'm looking them up right now. I have it in my presentation. I'll have that answer in just a minute.
Sure.
Here we go. Hold on.
Any other questions in the meantime?
Yeah, okay. So I've got this for a number of groups. Okay. I'll answer the age one first. This is from the Pew Study of American Jews done in 2020. It's considered to be probably the best study of American Jews that we've ever had. It cost millions of dollars. So 29% of Jewish men are Republicans versus 23% of Jewish women. By age, the 18 to 29-year-olds, the 30 to 49-year-olds, and the 50 to 64-year-olds are all around 27, 28% are Republicans. The 65 and over, the percentage Republican goes down a little bit. For those with high school or less, 40% are Republicans, probably because a pretty reasonable portion of the 18 to 29s of the high school or less are ultra-Orthodox Jews, okay, who don't tend to go to college. By the time you get to a college degree, 22% are Republicans, and for those Jews with graduate degrees, 18% are Republicans. I have Orthodox at 75% from Pew, Conservative at 28, Reform at 18, and Just Jewish at 22. Okay? So those are the categories that I was able to break the Pew study down and get political party data for.
So generationally,
Doesn't make a difference.
if I heard you correctly, there was almost no difference.
Almost no difference. The 65 and over is about 5% less Republican. Okay. But the other three age groups, 18 to 29, 30 to 49, 50 to 64, the differences there are within the margin of error, 2-3 percentage points.
Thank you, Ira. And I have a question, Mitchell. Is there a research specifically about the segment of population of Jews that are Israeli born or Israeli that have the voting right in the States? And is there a gap in their position versus their non-Israeli Jewish American counterparts?
Again, I'll Ira, I don't know. I mean, one of the problems with anything dealing with Israeli Americans is there's been a lot of debate as to how many there are. That there were some people who thought there was 500,000, some 800,000, some 1 million. I'm not sure anyone really knows how many there really are.
I have a proposal going into the Israeli American Council. They've asked me for one.
Okay.
To redo a study that I did back in 2006. All of the national studies that we have put the number of Israeli born in the United States as somewhere between 75 and 100,000. That's Israeli born. Okay. Now, if you add to that what I call Israeli associated, they were born, let's say, in the United States. They lived in Israel for 30 years, and now they're back. If you add in all those types of people, you have about 300,000 Israeli associated or born in the United States. If you speak Hebrew at home, if you tell the Census Bureau that the language you speak at home is Hebrew, and you weren't Israeli born, you're probably an Israeli, even though you weren't Israeli born. The anecdotal evidence on Israelis is that they do tend to support Trump, okay? But the reason we don't have really any real good data on it is that when you do a survey, even if you do 3,000 interviews, you might have 20 or 25 Israelis in the 3,000. and you don't have a large enough sample size to tell what their political party is. The margin of error is like plus or minus 30%. That's data that's useless. Okay.
Just for those of you who are listening, I'm a political scientist. Ira's the expert on demography, so that's why I deferred to him on these detailed questions.
Yeah, I am, by the way, the editor of the American Jewish Yearbook. And Mitch writes a long piece in here, probably about 20 to 25,000 words each year, on the American Jewish community and kind of the relationships with Israel and with Iran and issues like that, and just does a superb job. Okay, I recommend getting the book. I don't make any money on it, by the way.
Sure. Any last question from the audience? Anybody?
Anybody?
Oh, we got a question from Cindy Dolgan. Trump recently said that Jews who don't vote for him are, quote, crazy, and that if that is the case and he loses, it will be the Jews' fault. In your opinion, how has this impacted Jews' choice for president this year?
How does it affect Jews voting for president? I think that the Jewish community is much like the rest of the American public on this election, that the choices are pretty much baked in, that you either are a Trump supporter or you're a Harris supporter, and there's very little that either one of them can say at this point that will change your mind. If there are some Jewish voters out there who are undecided, maybe things like this will make a difference. In general, what makes Jews uncomfortable with Trump are less his policies about the Middle East than his policies unrelated to the Middle East and his character issues. In the case of Harris, in general, again, these are just generalities. What makes Jews, I think, uncomfortable with Harris are some of her attitudes towards Israel and sounding so in making such an effort to appeal to the Arab Americans in Michigan to win their favor in trying to show sympathy for the Palestinians, that there are some Jewish voters that see that as weaker support for Israel, and that she might, as president, be more influenced by the far left, the progressives in her party who want to cut aid to Israel. She has said that she would not do that, but we'll see if she's elected. But I think those are the kinds of issues that are, if anything, making a difference in Jewish voters. But at this point, again, people have, I think most Jews, like most Americans, have made up their minds, and you would have to have something incredibly extreme to happen for, I think, any Jewish voters or any of the public to make any dramatic changes in who they're going to vote for. It still could happen. We've got, what, 4 days left, 5 days left? And the war might yet make a difference. One of the reasons I would argue that the Biden administration had pressured Israel, and this isn't my saying it, it's what's been in the press, to limit its attack on Iran to military targets, was the fear that if Israel were to attack nuclear facilities, it would potentially set off an all-out war that the United States would have to get involved in, and that would hurt the Harris campaign. And if the Israelis attacked the oil facilities, that would cause a jump in the price of oil. That would harm the U.S. economy. It would raise oil and gas prices at the pump right before the election, and that would hurt Harris as well. So in that respect, the war could play a rule even up till the last day, depending on what happens. You know, the Iranians right now, today, are threatening to attack Israel again. And there's, you know, all sorts of speculation in the press of whether they're going to do it before or after the election. And that could make a difference. Things that are happening in Lebanon or in Gaza could end up making a difference in some way. But I think that's the one thing that would make the biggest difference in the outcome of the election would be if the oil sector was affected and oil prices suddenly spiked right before the election.
If I could add one more thing, the number that Mitch has for Jews in Pennsylvania is 100,000 too high, we've decided. And it's not Mitch's fault. Mitch is using my numbers. We just redid the numbers, and there'd been a study done in Philadelphia, which everyone now agrees, including the Philadelphia Federation, was 100,000 too high. And so I think you had 450,000 for Pennsylvania. I'll send you the new numbers, Mitch. The new number will be 350,000 in the Next American Jewish Yearbook. Okay? Just in case anybody uses the number, let's switch to the new one, because the other one was due to some faults in the study. Not my fault.
Well, it's an important thing. You know, it's an important fact, because that's
yeah. If it was 20,000, right? If it was
that's a large chunk
off,
of votes.
yeah. If I was 20,000 off here, if I changed it by 20,000, I wouldn't be bringing this up. But 450 to 350 is a big difference, and so I'll send you the new spreadsheet. Okay, Mitch?
Thanks.
All right, so we're getting to the end of this presentation. I would like to wrap this up. Thank you all for joining us today for this insightful discussion. I want to extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Mitchell Bard for his valuable presentation, and to each of you, of course, for your thoughtful questions and engagement. As we've seen, the Jewish vote will be pivotal in the upcoming election. We hope today's session provided clarity and a deeper understanding of the factors influencing this important voter demographic. Now, before we close, I encourage you to explore the Jewish Virtual Library and AICE's other resources, which offer accessible, reliable information on Jewish and Israeli history, politics, and culture. We would very much appreciate your contributions to our efforts. Our donation link can be found in the chat box. I just put it a few minutes ago. I'm also going to put the address of the website in case you are less familiar with it. In any case, thank you once again for being here. We look forward to seeing you at future events, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you all.